finances to get that scheme up and running. We should see it as a shared joy to have that diversity in our community and a shared responsibility to make sure that people have the support they need.
Peter Singer.
Well, I certainly agree that we should have diversity and that children with Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome, can have a lot to offer to particular families, and I totally agree that they should get good support. I also would say, though, that this is, if Down syndrome is detected during pregnancy, I think this is a choice that families can make for themselves. The pregnant woman can make for herself. Does she want to have a child with Down syndrome? And the fact is that the overwhelming majority of Australians, and throughout the world really, women who are told that their child will have Down syndrome early in pregnancy will decide to terminate the pregnancy.
Your system of ethics, in a way, delineates different types of humans, that is, human beings and human persons. Do you regard people with severe disabilities as having essentially the same rights as everybody else?
Well, I think if you're talking about severe intellectual disabilities, and I'm not now talking about Down syndrome, I'm talking about something much more profound than Down syndrome, I think that there are people who are human beings, but who don't have intellectual capacities to, for example, see themselves as living a life and really to be competent to make decisions or express preferences. So I think in a way, I would say they don't have the choices about whether to go on living that we do, and I think that means also that there is a difference in how important it is that they should go on living.
But do you seriously believe that they have a lesser humanity or a lesser
not a lesser
stake in it?
humanity. Well, I mean, they're all human beings, but for me, you see, being a human being isn't the morally decisive thing. I mean, that's just being a member of a particular species, and I don't think that really cuts the moral ice. I think what does is what kind of a life you can live, whether you can, for example, make choices about your life, and also, of course, whether you're capable of suffering. So if you're capable of suffering, then your interest in not suffering has to be considered and given the same weight as anyone else's suffering. But your interest in continuing to live your life, I think, does relate to some extent to whether you can see your life as something that actually exists over time, or whether you're so profoundly retarded that though you may be able to suffer, you don't see yourself as living a life. You know, perhaps you aren't even capable of a relationship with your mother or father. I think that does make a real difference.
Does that indicate, or in your system of ethics, would that bestow lesser rights upon persons with very severe disabilities?
A lesser right to life, I would say. Not a lesser right to have suffering, to avoid suffering, or to not have suffering inflicted on you, because if you're capable of suffering, that's all that's crucial there. But in terms of a right to life, I think, yes, that does make a difference.
Philip Blond.
Well, we just see the logic of this position gradually working itself out. It's death on one side, death on another. And what we're actually creating now is a subjective account of what's valid that other people fail. And if they fail it, well, they're in real trouble. So if you might have an accident, you might be impaired, under the same logic, Peter might off you. So the trouble is here, that this logic is profoundly confused, because actually what he's then saying is we have a category called suffering that in some sense is extensive across all life, period. But actually human life is more valid than any other form of life. Let's be honest about what, in terms of common sense, people have always thought, and what, in fact, the moral tradition has always thought. And part of that is because human beings can suffer more than any other form of life. And why? Because human beings have knowledge of their death. No non-human life has knowledge of their death. So by that token, even if a person is profoundly damaged, they still have knowledge of their death.
Well, how can
and therefore, their suffering, even on that criteria, is more important and more valid than others. And actually, what we start to see is actually this is a profoundly disturbing, quasi-fascistic, utilitarian destruction of our sort of life. And Peter, no, I believe this, because actually lots of things that other people think horrific, we now think as normal. There are people who think abortion is actually profoundly horrific, even if it's endorsed and popular. All forms of killing can and have been in our human society popular. These are not criteria for a moral and good society.
Let me go back to Peter Singer for a response to that. But can I just, to go back to the questioner's point, can I just pose this to you? Isn't the measure of a good society how it takes care of its absolutely most vulnerable people, whether you regard them as people or persons?
Well, certainly I think we should take care of the most vulnerable, but every society is limited to some extent in the resources it can use. There are millions, hundreds of millions, or a billion or more very vulnerable people in the world. I think we should be doing much more to help. We should be spending more of our resources on foreign aid where it can make a huge difference to people at very little cost.
If it costs a society, in your opinion, too much, you should let people die, or in fact cause them to die.
Possibly, and especially if there isn't really much quality of life in their lives. I mean, what Philip said... Sorry, just a minute, Philip. I'm talking now. What Philip said was simply factually false when he said that human beings, the implication was, have knowledge of their death. I mean, a baby born with anencephalic, that is, essentially, is never conscious of anything, not even conscious of another human being talking to them, of his or her mother. So how on earth can they be conscious, have knowledge of their death more than, for example, a dog or a cat has knowledge of its death?
I've got to respond to that, if I may.
Would you respond very briefly, because I want to hear from the rest of the panel.
We've just had Peter now endorsing the termination of all babies, because it follows that virtually most babies don't have knowledge of their death.
Mark Butler, we go to the point raised by the questioner, which is...
well, I thought it was a slightly more practical question than perhaps the last 5 minutes have indicated. And as Cassandra said, we're spending a lot of time talking about a national disability insurance scheme, which I think will give a much better level of support to families and individuals affected by disability, particularly profound intellectual disability. But I think also there's a more community-wide challenge about how we embrace people with intellectual disability, like your sister, I think it was, into mainstream activities like housing, like school and like work. I've seen over the last 20 years thousands of people with that level of disability move out of the large institutions into group homes, living a much more mainstream day-to-day life as a member of a household if they're not living with their family. I've seen a big spike in workforce participation rates by people with disability. I haven't seen the same spike of workforce participation by people with mental illness or psychiatric disability, which I still think is a significant challenge for our community. But that is the sort of thing I'd like to see our community continue to push the envelope on.
And I'll just get you to reflect briefly on the 5 minutes that you didn't think was part of the question.
It gave me a bit of a headache, I must say. I did first year philosophy and decided it wasn't for me, and my mind just didn't quite work that way, so I'm not sure I'd add much value to that.
Pragad.
Well, look, I think governments in societies like ours absolutely should support everybody having a range of choices about the way they live their lives. People do get great joy from loving a member of the family with a disability. Sometimes people with disabilities live terrible lives of agony and pain because there are things that they can't have and they can't feel and they can see they are not part of. And I think we've all seen that too. But I don't think it's a question. In a modern society, of course, everybody should have a chance to participate. It enriches us all. As I think has been said, the way we care for our most vulnerable is a test and a demonstration of the sort of people that we are.
I'll just go briefly back to our question, if I can.
No, I was just going to say, it's quite interesting just listening to the discussion now. It's all quite deficit-focused when you kind of are discussing people with disabilities in terms of what they can't contribute to society. Exactly. I think it would be better actually and more constructive to actually focus on a more strengths-based approach in terms of what they actually can contribute, even if it's unique or even if it is outside perhaps our range of experiences or our range of understanding, and perhaps that will actually not only shift the dialogue here tonight but also in the media and in the public more generally as well.
Thank you. We'll take that as a comment to finish that section of the discussion. Thank you very much. Let's move along. Our next question tonight comes from Oliver Damien.
I have a question for Philip Blunt. Do you think that similar to what happened in the UK, Australian politics has fallen into the trap of individualistic social liberalism on the left and an equally individualistic economic liberalism on the right, to the detriment of society as a whole? And do you believe that the way out of this trap is a new politics, what you call the big society, or what is essentially a new Tory progressive conservatism?
You wrote that question, didn't you?
I'm shocked. I'm shocked that Oliver grasps my politics far better than I do. So I'd like to talk to you, Oliver, and learn from you what I should believe.
Philip, can I ask you, just for the audience who probably don't necessarily, apart from one or two of us, understand what big society is, give us a brief potted description.
Look, what I want to suggest to you is that actually one of the reasons you're also angry about politics, one of the reasons you feel so cheated by contemporary politicians, is that actually the left and the right are the same, because both of them deliver the same outcomes. If you look across the Western world, what we've created is democracy produces oligarchy, money and power has flowed upwards, decisions and the capacity to make a difference are being stripped from ordinary people. And what I argue in Red Tory, and what Oliver, I think, has said far better than I, is actually what's gone wrong is a form of liberalism has become unhinged. And on the left, we've had social liberalism that said, forget about people, forget about commitments, essentially sleep with who you want. There is no consequence for anything you do. And that destroyed working class communities, the foundation of human association, the family. And then the right copied the left and said, well, let's have a market-based approach where we, in sense, just have a world of individuals. But the trouble is, if you just believe in individuals, what actually happens when they compete is the most powerful individuals win everything and everybody else is left with very little. And that's the type of society we've created, a society that doesn't believe in anything, that just competes for its own self-interest. And what happens is we all lose. So my politics are about, and what the big society is about, is restoring our society, ending social isolation and recapitalising the poor and indeed recapitalising the middle class and creating an economy that works for everybody and a society where people aren't abandoned and left alone.
OK, we've got another question on this topic. I'm going to go to that before we bring in the rest of the panel. It's from Samuel Aragon.
Yeah, my question is basically from what you've just said. And you've got the lady beside you, the ACOS. Already, wouldn't it, the egg's unscrambled, how are you going to go back to that? We don't have grandparents at home anymore that are going to look after your children, all that sort of thing, etc., etc. It's just, it'd be almost impossible to go back to that.
Well, Samuel,
and why would you want to, really?
Well, you'd want to because people are going to need to because, as I'm sure the Minister can attest later, we're in crisis situations with how we look after our old, how we look after our young, and indeed how we even secure ourselves. And there are ways to, in some sense, crowd in good behaviour. And one of the things we can do is simply shift the incentives that push money and power away from people and try to reverse them. So a lot of my politics are actually saying, look, let's empower small businesses, let's empower the self-employed, let's actually let those at the bottom of society be recapitalised. They can take over the budget spent on them. We should let them run and manage public expenditure in the budgets precisely because that will stop them being passive, make them active.
So just the one thing we've sort of left out of this equation is you actually, if I understand it correctly, want to reduce the role of government in delivering social services in particular?
Well, I want to reduce the role of government insofar as government isn't effective, but I want to increase the role of government insofar as government is effective. The government, for instance, can't love you. Across the world, if people go in car... well...
This government can, Philip. Yeah. This government can.
The last time I saw that on Q&A was when Zizek was stroking Tony's shoulder most affectionately, and I'm not sure it led anywhere good.
Oh, okay.
It didn't lead anywhere at all,
I appreciate
except to other people responding to the question. So I'll bring in... I'll just bring in Cassandra here. You can keep coming in and out, but I want to hear what Cassandra's thoughts are, because she's obviously...
Well, look, obviously, I think it'd be great if more politicians talked about love. I think that'd be fantastic, and a little bit more of that as part of the political discourse. But I think Philip's portrayal of where society has got to is kind of negative. It's not our experience. I've got to say, right across Australia, it's full of amazing people at community level, loving,
Absolutely.
Coming together, doing great work. We've got small initiatives going on the ground in local communities. I see people nodding in the audience. You're all involved in it. I mean, Australia-wide, we have 600,000 civil society organisations.
Exactly.
So that's one organisation for 36 people in Australia. It's full of this great activity.
And does big government get in the way of all of this?
No, I think, well, clearly there is a role for government. I mean, Philip talked about, you know, the people who are the most vulnerable